Socrates. The only true wisdom consists in knowing that you know nothing. That's us, dude. Oh, yeah. Let's bag him. Yeah.
Socrates. Okay, so what's that knowledge of what's truly important called? I guess that would be wisdom, Socrates. Oh, to find happiness, you must have first cultivated wisdom. Tell me how you...
All we are is dust in the wind, dude. Dust, wind, dude.
How is Socrates within and without? How is he liminal? How is he monstrous?
I'm almost done with that. So today will be kind of 14-15. I again don't have any Jeopardy questions because I feel like John, and now we can blame Christopher as well, are being very ungenerous in their Jeopardy setups. Some people can, in their podcasting, set up very generous Jeopardy opportunities, and I think they both kind of fail at that in the last couple episodes. Do you, Layman, have any parts of the 2 episodes that like really called your name out and opened up a sacred questioning from you?
Well, I was very focused last time, I think, on 14. But so I've sort of forgotten all about that now, and I'm all about Kierkegaard. I love and have a lot of respect and enjoyment for the way Chris comes at this. His particular areas of focus and the things he extracts from them, I find them very edifying. I've been really a big Kierkegaard fan for a long time. And I actually have this book that they gave me in, I think, Existentialism 201. It was called the Kierkegaard Reader. And I had made a collage, and it was a collage of a group of people in black and white and a tiny shirtless Elvis trying to find his way through their legs. And I slipped it into this book. And it's been in the pages of this book for 20 years. And I've given this book to other people and gotten it back years later. So when I open Kierkegaard, for me, there's this image of Elvis trying to find his way in a forest of giant people.
I don't even know what to do that. I think aporia has already been achieved by, we went way past like awe and wonder into absurdity in record time today. I think that was, do those, like, he talks in episode 14 too about how we see through images and how images help us to kind of get into the depths of life. So does that image have particular symbolic meaning to you, or is it just more of this really evocative image and this evocative text that have been kind of associated together, like an uncle that always brings a weird guest to a dinner or something?
It depends what we mean by the image, right? Is it the image that I put into that book, or is it the image of that book open with that other image inside it? Which I think is the more interesting thing, because there's something about Kierkegaard that, in the stuff Bruce and I do, there's a way of thinking like either or, and or both and. So they all have this way to use the intensity of the interstitial gestural role of the slash, but there's a sense in which that always spills just beyond itself into that adjacent space. So for me, one of the things I like about the image is when you think about it, you're not thinking of Elvis in a forest of legs. You're thinking of Elvis in a forest of legs framed just peripherally by this sense of the entire opus of Kierkegaard. And to Chris's point, right, that's an image that's very particular to my personal life and to one of the characters I play. And I think part of this discussion is and should be about how the universal gets instantiated in the personal, in the deeply peculiarly personal, which is, I think, one of the great things that Kierkegaard stands for.
Yeah, I think both those things are true, right? I love that. I love Chris's love of Kierkegaard more than Kierkegaard, I would say, as an individual. And he really mines Kierkegaard deeply and has like almost like a reverence. It probably wouldn't even be a stretch to say a reverence for him. And yes, I like Kierkegaard's existentialism, but I also find his kind of moroseness limiting. And also, like what you just said, Layman, another thing that I think jumped out to me really strongly is that either or, it's almost too binary. Like he gets self-limiting in like all of Europe does, I think. And Hegel, the way Hegel interprets the mind, as John mentions, even kind of sets that up continentally in some sense. Um, yeah, Bruce, what is your initial kind of reaction to 15 or to Layman's colorful story about Elvis and photographs?
Well, I am coming to this actually with a little bit of 14 in my mind also, and 15. I'm happy to go with either. I had not finished 14 the last time we were talking, and I think it actually, what's resonating with me from 14 is actually applicable in 15 as well, which is really, part of it was the emphasis in it on some aspects of truth really only being available through dialogical disclosure, that we need the other and we need the relationship of person to person in order to be able to actually even intuit the through line. You know, he was giving the example of the monks all standing around the image that seems to be looking in all directions at the same time, and everyone can report, and only through that can they discover, you know, what's shared. And I think Chris got at that a little bit in talking about how Kierkegaard enacts these different characters and these, you know, pseudonymous identities, and then these different characters, and he doesn't really explicitly say it in the way that John was wanting to pull for, but through the engagement with those multiple different characters and the ways that each one demonstrates the peculiarities of his own trappedness in the repetition, and that comes through, and that there's an ability to see something beyond, you know, the limited presentations, but it's only disclosed in, you know, intersubjectively, in mutuality. So maybe I won't get into it right away, but one thing that I'm resonating with around that is some work by Beatrice Brutto and the theologian Daniel Walsh, and also Sloterdijk, where they're all looking at what are the peculiarities of person relations as distinct from the relationship between things. And I can get into that, but, you know, one of the core issues in their exploration is this whole turning on the many and the one. And I think for the religion that's not a religion, for whatever we're exploring as integral post-metaphysical spirituality or other, you know, meta-modern spirituality, things that are emerging, I think that's one of the things that we really need to center and elevate again is myriology. I think there's like, we haven't really wrestled with that in terms of, you know, I think contemporary popular culture, even though there's a lot of richness, if you look back, you know, at the historical record, you know, some profound insights from East and West into that. And of course, McGilchrist is taking it up, you know, with the matter with things. He's got a big section on the many and the one, and Jorge Ferrer has been wrestling with it, and we've been doing our own things with the many one in terms of post-metaphysical spirituality. So anyway, I can weave those things together later, but yeah, that's where I'm sitting with it right now.
You know, I don't want to take issue with the statement that Kierkegaard is morose, but I'd like to say that we don't know how morose he is or isn't. I think there's partly because he's speaking mostly through these pathologoi, right? Through these affective world characters that Chris is talking about. Who do we look to represent the affect of Kierkegaard, right? when he presents in his own name as a kind of civically spirited theologian in his edifying discourses and things like that, there seems to be a kind of love and joy there that's quite impressive. You know, I think Chris at one point in the episode 15 talks about this almost forced performative extroversion of Kierkegaard at lunch going out into the streets. But I don't think we know for sure whether that's forced or not, or whether or not his work, which is very focused on embracing and exploring some dense and anxious conditions, isn't a way for him to sort of optimize his own existential situation toward love and overflowing joy, right? Which is also something we see in his, you know, he has this interesting relationship to Nietzsche, who's also perceived very morosely until you read it and you're just like, oh my God, he's constantly confessing joy through this. That's very interesting. So I'm not going to say that he isn't morose, but I just think we don't know how morose or non-morose Kierkegaard is.
Yeah, I think there's this like subtle judgment, the cynical Christian judgment that kind of weaves into some of his writings. I'm not a Kierkegaard scholar. I've read most of his major works partially, and I don't dislike his writing style, but it doesn't call to me. And so like out of all the existentialists, I don't read him a lot, although I've read him not that unrecently. And like Either Or, for example, have you guys read that? Yeah, it sounded like it, especially Layman, from your one like 20 years of relationship with that book. That's pretty cool. Like it just feels like there's a condescension on the aesthetic soul that it doesn't quite get to where, like, it doesn't have that aha that the ethical soul has, that forces it into the ethical path. And I just feel like it's a little morose. Like it struggles with ambiguity beautifully, but then it misses, I think, that ambiguity of the lived experience versus that either or positing.
It might, but at the same time, like if we were to look at this through the lens of, say, developmental levels, right? So you could take the aesthetic and the ethical and the religious as emergent stages of how we hold worlds, right? So that each one has some value to it, but can legitimately be judged as insufficient by the next one, which in turn is also insufficient up to the point where you can really inhabit the paradoxical space that's represented by the intensity of the slash mark in that either or choice. And that, for me, is where Kierkegaard seems to be constantly trying to get. He's constantly trying to take Western philosophy to the point of Zen koan. And Zen koan seems like a very restrictive environment, which it is. But that restriction is an opportunity that affords you an incredible freedom and bliss if you lean into it.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I just think like Hakuin or some of the Zen koan makers do it better than the Europeans in the 1800s. And the Europeans have this, I think the transcendence puts them so far away from the sacred that there's this, it's subtle, like kind of pessimism is constantly sneaking in. But again, I understand where you're saying, Layman, 100%.
I don't disagree that Europeans are trash. They clearly are, but I'm just not sure how much it applies or doesn't to Kierkegaard.
No, that's fair. No, it's totally fair. I'll take the leap of faith and jump over to that position.
I think it could be fair to say, and this is actually a Kierkegaardian lesson in a way, on the value of the unique, is that the Kierkegaard that Layman is talking about might be similar to the Nietzsche that Layman is talking about, which is a figure that no one has ever yet encountered until they were filtered through the Layman.
Yeah, I have no patience for a non-transcendental, non-blissful Kierkegaard, so I need to make sure that I've secured that one.
I remember back in Christian college when I was coming in as a somewhat mystical Catholic, playing, like I mentioned, I think last time, with the Book of Hours and Episcopalian Book of Hours, but I was somewhere between those worlds. But I was in a Church of Christ environment, which was quite different. And it was very, very much about conformity and about, you show up to chapel, you say the right things, you profess the right words about the Lord, and all of those kinds of things. And if you haven't taken the right steps and said the right things, then we have reason to worry about your existential condition. And so that was in that environment where I encountered Kierkegaard the first time. And in that environment, Kierkegaard was very bracing and refreshing, because he was wrestling with all that superficiality and really wanting to say, there is something here within the Christian teaching and truth that really grapples with core existential concerns that are not showing up in typical social, mythic membership expressions of Christianity. So for me at that point, it was a breath of fresh air, and I really enjoyed reading him. But I actually didn't continue with him. And so Chris's passion is inviting me back to look again.
I remember, Bruce, when you and I did that response video to the Elusive Eye series, a lot of my focus in that was on the relationship between Socrates and Kierkegaard, and the way that they sort of point to two distinct subsets of Greg's model of justification systems. I mentioned this in the Conciliates Conference talk as well. For me, the two things you need in order to have spirituality and religion in Greg's set of justifications is you need this thing I call the end zone, which is epitomized by Socrates, right? It's a way of taking into your care all of the possible justification systems, both for the well-being of people who hold those systems and for your own ongoing movement into and through justification systems. And you need to have a certain kind of structure so that you can sort of be endlessly moving into depth in this special subset of the meta justificatory systems. And a lot of the communities that we're involved with are in that space. But then there's also the possibility of the truly trans-justificatory system. And what marks that space? Fundamental paradoxes, fundamental undoings of the basic alternatives that seem to permeate all possible justification systems. And for Kierkegaard, that's the Christ figure. Christ isn't just a sage by which you endlessly draw yourself into an increasingly good fit. He's also a fundamental figure that says everything that makes sense can't make sense at some point, and you may have to unlock that door in addition to the door of endlessly unfolding wisdom.
Yeah, I like the paradoxicality of Kierkegaard. I think he's like especially with Christ, right? Even just the act of so deeply embracing Socrates and Christ is a little paradoxical, because they have these antagonistic. One is a philosopher par excellence, asking for like complete justification, and one is saying you need to look no further. I'm the pattern of glory and meaning in human life, and you can just stop where I am and be at the fountain of intelligibility in human virtue. So yeah, I appreciate his capacity to hold both figures. I think there's something really talented in that, because you usually strip away one or the other in that pursuit and minimize them towards some kind of unconscious or conscious bias. But he has that tension to really, really honor Socrates in that dialogue clearly while showing deepest respect and reverence for the Christian God, for Christ. What else can we say here, Bruce? I'm again kind of, the irony of what I'm learning here is more than what I think I brought to this.
I think an aspect of this is John talked about it a little bit in terms of working with paradox. I think he was talking about it in the context of Nicholas of Cusa, but talking about you can look at contradiction and paradox, and you can try to resolve it but you can also hold the opposites at the same time and look through them. And that simultaneous holding allows for the attainment of a stereoscopic depth vision that is not possible when you're just basically wrestling with them propositionally or trying to resolve them conceptually. That they afford a different kind of perspective if held together in that way. And John didn't really like the coincidence of opposites phrase, so it's more the it's a tighter, more intimate union than that. You could say, I mean, maybe Kitaro Nishida gets at that a little bit, with contradictory identity, which is, I think, a little bit more intense of a statement of the coincidence of opposites.
That notion of different degrees of intensity, I think, is very important. When I think about the metaphysics of adjacency having these sort of three levels, and these are three levels of irony, essentially. Irony opens you up to this space where you can see that there are different positions to take, that there's a world of relativistic worlds and contexts. So that's the very spaced out, very easy one. And then you can move to this more structured approach, right? A deeper coincidence of opposites or stereoscopic seeing through, where there are levels of patterning to reality that are only available to you when you're not just seeing that there's multiples, but you're seeing that these two examples of the multiplicity collectively and only collectively unlock some additional range of patterning. But then there's the absolute intensity, so to speak, of entering into the tension between them and staying just with the tension of it, which is something a koan invites you to. I think it's also something Kierkegaard invites you to. And in Kierkegaard's challenge to Hegel, which is really a challenge to the students of Hegel, because this stuff's actually in Hegel, I would say, he's saying if you want to have the universal and the particular, if you want to be able to bring theory into life and into the body, you actually have to enter specifically into the intensity of that either or choice, of the way that two parallaxical alternatives pull on the same space and pull on the individual trying to inhabit that space. And you have to use your will to tolerate that. And that's the place where the Hegelian system can actually be instantiated. But if you don't undergo the visceral tension of it, then the great system remains a great system that only simulates the world rather than actually merges with it.
Yeah, it's I like that about all the existentialists, how they take Socrates and make him into like a living being. Like I think what Bruce, what you were saying, like the Kyoto school, they are so much simpler and I guess more elegant in their simplicity of dealing with this paradoxicality, because they're so much more comfortable with the non-being aspect of being and the kind of dynamic nature of things, like that there is a heat is in smoke, right? Like the element of fire is in every log and things like that. Like they're much more comfortable with kind of a Janus-faced multi-aspectual experience that then has that kind of through lines that John talks about, that is like no thingness, or the chiasm. John used that term, which is a more kind of Platonic Greek inroad to the same idea. And yeah, I think that's where Kierkegaard can be really elegant, is that he's trying to be existential, phenomenological, like he precedes Merleau-Ponty in some ways, and that he's trying to get at the phenomena itself through the paradoxes and the ironies. Yeah, I like that again. I think I said this last time too, that God is something like the Finsting beyond Finsting, or some suchness, and just the whole salience Gansfeld of, okay, I've noticed a through line through the aspects, and then I've noticed a through line through that, and that through line through that doesn't actually require me pointing to the aspects anymore. It's like a transcendence of the particular through the particular, maybe. And yeah, the complexifying of like your ontology as you do this in a participatory way, is kind of the value, I think, part of the value of why they were bringing it up in the video.
There's something about knowledge as conformity that John has been talking about, where it's a participatory knowledge. It's not, knowledge about, it's not propositional, but it's, perspectival and more deeply participatory. And I think, Layman, for instance, is just talking about that with the different levels of adjacency, is in a sense knowing through conformity by inhabiting the chiasm, right? It's bringing yourself into that place where your own being conforms to, and there's a conjunction of ways of knowing and being, and in that very living out of the holding that chiasmic tension.
Yeah, and I think that's it's an important point relative to a lot of postmodern spirituality, because when we say, let's talk about the finsting of the finstings, or what's the through line of all the suchnesses, and you go, well, the great suchness, the great beingness of things. And there's a lot of talk like that in 20th century spirituality, but that's you have a kind of passive relationship to the dispersed homogeneity, which isn't the same as developing your own beingness in its intensity so that it can be one of those finsted things that can join in the great finsting. And I think that's part of what Kierkegaard's saying here. Or C.S. Lewis had this remark that the gods won't speak to us until we have faces, right? That you need to develop the intensity of the experience of your own being / non-being in order to show up as a participant in the greater through line of all the forms of being. And one of the ways people let themselves off the hook for that is to just say that there is this being and I just accept that or surrender to it, but I don't actually have to undergo any particular personal either or tensions that would make me into one of the beings who can participate in the intensity of that beingness. So I see him holding an argument that's very pertinent to moving postmodern spirituality into a functional metamodern spirituality.
Yeah, I like DC Schindler's kind of portrayal of Socrates, and he's also Christian. So when he scholarizes Socrates, it's very much, you could see parallels to Christ in his works, and the good is made real, right, by our own self-transcending, our own egoic relativism. But then the best version of the good is both relative and absolute. I know in the Eastern, the more the Kyoto school, they'll say like absolute mediation. So the absolute mediates all absolute activity of the relative or something. Like they get very wordy, but in a good way with that. And yeah, so I like what you're saying, Layman, that it's like, oh no, you're part of this being and you're called, like, I guess that's what the repetition, that the moral of that point of that repetition is, like, you keep falling for the same failing patterns, and there's a systematicity to your failure that if you'd realize this kind of systematic error in all the micro moments, then you'd actually have the knowledge to self-transcend. And then also lurking in any one moment is the unknowingness of that moment too, which you systematically can kind of encounter.
Yeah, and not just the knowledge to self-transcend, but the will to undergo the experience that's required to move you out of that repetition loop. I think Kierkegaard does an admirable job of staying very tightly focused on that.
Yeah, he appreciates responsibility deeply, like the idea of like everyone, the most ethical moment is just like personal accountability towards being a part of ultimate reality, but not ultimate, like all of ultimate reality or something like that.
I'm cautious. In the beginning, I was cautious about bringing in some of those elements from Brutto and others, because I don't know if it's going to go a little bit too far afield from Kierkegaard and Socrates, but in a way, I'm trusting, for instance, you, Rob, to be more knowledgeable about the Socratic tradition than me. So I'll look to you and Layman to offer some reflection back on that. But I think what I wanted to bring in is really resonant with what's coming up right now in the dialogue. So Brutto has, she's really well known for writing about Aurobindo. She's done a lot of writing on Aurobindo, but she's also written on Christian, theology and ecological theology and things like that. But she's got an essay called Non-Dual Communitarianism, on the many and the one. And she's really looking at different kinds of existential relationships, kind of in the tradition of Buber, for instance, but also deeply informed by Eastern traditions and contemplative traditions. So she's looking at what is, when we have subjects who come together, we are differentiated. Basically, objects are differentiated by what they are not, by negation. That their identity is determined by negating that, the cat is not the dog because it doesn't have these things. And you can basically, trace out object space in that way through negation. But when it comes to the individual as a subject, there's two ways you can relate to yourself. Often you relate to yourself by turning yourself into an object, and then you name my qualities and my traits and my virtues and my vices. And she's saying, but beyond that, there is this direct participation in a living activity, which can't be really defined. It's indefinable. It's indefinite in that regard. And therefore, subjectivities are not different from each other. And yet they're not collapsible into a one. The subjectivities together are mutually affirming. In my knowing, my knowing becomes its knowing through your knowing, right? But there's nothing that we can point to at the level of what Daniel Walsh calls natures in terms of identifiable discrete characteristics that separate us. So there's both a kind of a oneness and a manyness in the co-participation of I to I. So she's wanting to look at beyond the I, it, right, which is, I relating to an object instrumentally and all of that, right? And then there's the I, thou, where I relate to the other as a thou. And as a thou, I see that there's another I to look into, and I see that they're looking back at me, and I want to, enter into respectful relationship with them and honor their own subjective depth. But beyond that, in love, there's something that happens where I don't want just to reflect your you back to you, or to make space for you, or for you to relate. I want to join in your I. I want to move into your stream, your living stream, in a way that I can begin to see and feel and be through you in a way that, it's a deepened intimacy, right? And that the I to the I wants to live in that kind of relationship. But she argues that if there are only two, dyadic relationship, usually that love or that participation remains incomplete. There's something reciprocal about it that is a kind of a dependency. And that a deeper layer of a mature, fulfilled eye-to-eye participation is when you are willing to love, and it's through your will. It's you are willing to love who the other loves in your love of them. But you are not loving who the other loves just because the other loves them. And if you didn't love them, you would just disregard that other person. No, you want to participate in their eye to the degree that you love them genuinely as they love them, right? And so she says the persons naturally in their participation with each other unfold into this sense of community, not just dyadic relation, but at minimum 3 and actually through extension. But there's this eye to eye to eye co-participation, co-indwelling, co-being that is neither mere identity, nor is it separable natures. It's what she calls non-dual communitarianism. And of course, she's pointing both to certain, Buddhist notions, pratityasamutpada, and the uniqueness of the Buddhas. Each Buddha is unique and yet also not two, right? But also to perichoresis, circumincession and perichoresis within Christian tradition. And similarly, Sloterdijk approaches that territory. I'm going to read a little quote from Sloterdijk from, I think it's his book, Bubbles. Places of God, in non-theological terms, places of co-subjectivity or coexistence or solidarity, are not things that simply exist in the external space. They only come about as sites of activity of persons living together a priori or in strong relationship. Hence, the answer to the question where, in this case, is in one another. Perichoresis means that the milieu of the persons is entirely in the relationship itself. The persons contained in one another in the shared space locate themselves in such a way that they illuminate and pervade and surround one another without being harmed by the clarity of difference.
This relationally located, implicitly transcendental plural finitude brings up a couple of different things for me. I think one is how important it, at least for me, it is to appreciate Kierkegaard as a civic being, which is something he shares with Socrates. Socrates is a kind of spiritual gardener in Athens, and he loves the polis. There's an embodied perichoresis of the polis, and Kierkegaard is going out, and we need to appreciate him not just as working with a community of pseudo selves in the writing, but also as a person who was very fundamentally interested in moving through his community and taking care for that as if it was a sacred duty, which is also something maybe not exemplified by the Christ character as much, but certainly deep in the DNA of the Christian approach, right? This care for the community, but the care has to be not grounded in how well that community obeys a dogma. It has to be a sacred that's found in the community because the community is the community, because it's a place where that relational circumstance is on offer. So that was one side, is I think that positions Kierkegaard really nicely between Christianity and Socrates, is his sense that the civic spirit is a religious spirit. I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. The other thing is I go now in my mind to Water and Narcissus, which is a collection of notebooks that Frank Jones, who later was called Adida, who was a specialist in devotional, divine, human, non-dual realization practices, very controversial character. A lot of people very passionate for and against feelings about this guy. But his philosophical journals during the time of his development are collected as Water and Narcissus, and they're very Kierkegaardian. And what he's putting himself up against in those journals is his sense that there's a dilemma of alternatives in the way he can approach the world, that he could be indulgent or he could try to discipline himself. But the mere fact that he stands before that is already the prison that he's in. He can't, there's something about that situation that he can't bear, so he escapes from each one into the other. He keeps medicating his discipline with his indulgence and vice versa. And so throughout his growth in this very interesting journal he kept, he's constantly trying to put that contradiction right in his face so that he can't escape. There's no way for the effort of relational engagement and freedom to be separate things. As soon as it's a choice, you've already done something wrong. And I see that in Kierkegaard. He's constantly trying to put that dilemma in your face, because there isn't a solution except by accepting and penetrating into that dilemma. That's a really beautiful thing. I think about Kierkegaard, and I love that it reaches out to me as the core of his spirit life. And when we ask, like, what's his message, what's his method, that's what it is. It's not just to be able to ironically move through the lenses of these different pathologoi, in which the partial articulation of truth is a way of honoring the truth that is beyond partiality. I love that Chris brings that up, but it's also a way of him saying to us, like, look, don't try to get out of this trap. Really be in this trap. The alternatives are not real alternatives. Let them thwart each other in your experience. That's an opening to something.
I think you're muted.
Oh, you're right. I was muted. I get so excited about Kierkegaard and these paradoxical corners he paints us into. It's like, if my arrow keeps going half the distance, it'll never get there. If I'm purely aesthetic, then I'll never get there. But also, if I'm purely ethical, I'll never get there. The confronting you, and then I think John brings this up too in the episode, like, reality, does it really have a telos? Is it really begging us to be ethical or aesthetic? Is there actually like this beckoning from the void to conform in those two directions to the void? Which again is like a very European kind of trap that they're just in by deifying a historical avatar. They get stuck in like their own relationship to the transcendent through the immanent, through his immanence in some sense. You go ahead, Layman. Did you
That
want to?
historical avatar thing, right? Kierkegaard takes that up into
He
the
does,
psychology I've been talking about, right?
Yeah.
This impressed the hell out of me when I first read Kierkegaard, was the absurdity argument for Christ. Right? You're like, I'm going to take the infinite and locate it in the finite. I'm going to take the transcendental. I'm going to go, that one guy, that one time, that was the transcendental, and no other guys at no other times. And you're like, he's like, that's so improbable and so impossible to believe that it affords you the greatest possibility of faithful engagement, because it can't make any sense. It violates the fundamental justification system categories. So that's an example of Kierkegaard critiquing that very thing that we're caught up in, projecting it onto this historical character. But we could get out of that if we understood that projection as fundamentally grounded in this dilemma that you have to embrace.
Yeah, it's very clever. Yeah, I like what you just said there, because again, the Kyoto school is trying to also point to that. It's like, if you can just look at it and transcend a little bit of it, then you can get to this other place on the other side of it that's really interesting. But you have to go through it. You can't ignore it or go around it in some sense. I like.
Also,
yeah, go ahead.
One more thing about this episode
please.
I wanted to bring up, which is, I want to give a shout out to Martin Haglund. His take on Kierkegaard and finitude is fantastic. You can tell it's informing this discussion that Chris and John had, and I just think that This Life is worth a read for anybody. A really powerful book on how the thing you think you want from escaping the finite is located in the finite itself.
Could you say more about that, just if someone had never heard of this before?
Maybe Bruce will. He's read it.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I think he does a really good job of pointing to how the things we value most are not delivered to us by typically our most revered religious concepts or ideals. In terms of, if we think about eternity or infinity or everlasting this or that, right? That really love and cherishing and beauty and all of these different kinds of things only are manifest through our confrontation with the limitation of things and the possibility for the ending of things. that basically it's only in the sight of the finite that the things that we truly value are as spiritual even have any sense or meaning, and that if we were deposited in a space where all of those the boundaries of finitude were erased, there actually would not be any of those things that we value or are pursuing in a spiritual life.
Yeah, if you get a chance, Rob, Haglund, it alternates between his autobiography and taking up these characters, Augustine, Kierkegaard, Marx to some degree. It's a really powerful book, and it makes this argument. Essentially, if you took value and you broke it into an infinite number of pieces and distributed it over eternity, it would be no value at all. That's too much. You can only get value, even spiritual, transcendental value, by accepting the framework of affinitude, which is also what's in Kyoto. It's also what's in the Zen koans, right? The only place for omnipresence is that glade out back behind the monastery, no other places. You have to be able to do both of those moves in order to elicit the transcendental possibility.
Yeah, in some sense, that's the hypophatic John said. It's like you have to accept both to see the beauty. And I like, again, that's what I love about the Kyoto school is they don't try to have a synthesis of that dialectic. They allow it, where the Europeans, I think, keep trying to create a synthesis of being and non-being. They let it kind of be, for lack of pun potential on that. But yeah, I think I love, there's a Hebrew proverb where they go like, oh, there's this farmer and he hates his life. His house is too small. His wife is annoying. His cows are like too thin, because everyone wants their cows to not be thin. And then he goes to see a rabbi, and the rabbi says like, oh, bring like a big, horrible, smelly cow into your house for a week. And then he's like, oh, now it's even worse. Not only do I have all those 5 problems I just listed, I have like a mess in my house. They says, oh, take the cow out. And then like the apophatic, transcendence of the bad cow makes him grateful for the original life that he had. And also, like, I think it's really beauty. Everything beautiful is dying. It's a kind of a thing that you can look for, go like, oh wow, that beautiful flower, the tree, right? The sunset is fading away. So yeah, I think there's a lot of insight into what you're both saying that author was pulling out of Kierkegaard or pulling forward.
So one thing that might be interesting to discuss, I think, is the way that Chris positions the ironically held partial perspective as being either a relationship to the implied reality or as a kind of degenerate form of bullshit enactment, right? And that the idea being that you can't say the virtue, you can't partially articulate the ultimate, but you can acknowledge that you can't, and through that acknowledgement you can partially enact it, which is all that you can do. But by understanding that, you're placing yourself in relationship to that which is beyond the ability of your partial enactment. And that's the right. But if you don't do it that way, if you don't have that ironic perspective on your attempt to articulate it, then you get trapped in a kind of self-degenerating enclosure, which causes it to be the bullshit version of the same thing. I thought that was a very powerful idea he kept trying to bring forth throughout that whole discussion.
Yeah, when John does the hesychastic prayer, he also kind of emphasizes that there's the it's like the submission and the return both happen in those last few levels of like kenosis of the return, that if you flip them, you become this like arrogant being that's like, I am the source, holy moly, look at the one right here, rather than like seeing it in the simultaneity, like transcending the kind of parallel processing that our brain has to do to make this like infinite many into a coherent one, or an infinite one into a coherent many. The kind of self-transcendence of both, I need my ego, and it's also like the smallest piece of good in existence, or something like that. Like there's so much other moreness happening in being. Again, that kind of Fin's
unless
thing.
you retroactively presume an ontologically prior and more intense version of the virtue you're trying to enact, then your enactment becomes corrupt and the actions of your agency cease to have the function that you're hoping agency will have for you.
That's what he's saying, right? Like when Chris and John are saying, like, you can flip it and get it backwards. Yeah. Bruce, you've been quiet over there.
Just taking it in. I don't know if I have anything that's coming up for me right now that I want to share. Just taking it in.
Yeah, the one and the many get tricky. I liked the God is more than quote, because I love this idea of moreness. When I started doing a lot of meta practice, you can always find someone beautiful if you just acknowledge that there's moreness to them. And I thought that was cool that he was bringing back this almost like medieval language to say, like, God is more than a rock, or more than my mother, or more than Chat GTP.
Yeah, I was talking on the last one we did a little bit about the relationship between the hyperphatic and the hypothetically hypophatic, because there is a sense in which hyperphatic is even more than just the simultaneity of the cataphatic and the apophatic. It's the fact that there's the possibility of a coherent and valuable more than the sum of the parts in anything that we can intelligibly engage with, right? That's a part of the heart of the metaphysics that I stand with. However, there has to already be a space which allows that to be, right? There has to be a hypophatic space in which the hyperphatic integration can come forth, which is implied as its ontological background. So that's very interesting to me. Unless things are assumed to occupy a relational intercontextual space, there's nowhere for them to find the ratio position at which the hyperphatic is actually instantiated in someone's experience of an other of any kind.
And that's very much William Desmond's concern. And for him, that's how he articulates agape. Agape is that space, the agapic between that is the space that allows for that instantiation. And when there is that instantiation, then there is automatically an encounter with ontological excess, with the overdetermination of being.
What does that mean, ontological excess? Like, so if you were on like the 20th level of angels and someone was down like the 16th level of angels, or maybe the 2nd level of angels, and they heard you echo that across the heavens, and they were like, what is that? What does that mean?
Did you ever read Meeting with the Archangel?
No, what's that?
By Stephen Mitchell?
I know Stephen Mitchell, the like kind of self-help, positive psychology kind of fella.
Yeah. He does a lot of the translations of the mystical poetry.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
But yeah, he did a book where he was an author who wrote a book called Against Angels. Within the novel, he was playing the role, or the star of the book was a novelist who wrote a book called Against Angels, blasting all the angelology that was taking over New Age culture. And he was reclining in his backyard, and a buck naked Michael shows up in his backyard and confronts him, and then introduces him to the real world of angels. And in that encounter, it takes him through mind-blowing wrestling with paradox and ontological excess and entering into the depths of suffering. He guides him through not reasoning about or rationalizing about or trying to respond to the evil of the Holocaust, because the star of the book is a Jewish guy, but actually to go in and intimately inhabit the space of possibility of the Holocaust, within himself. So anyway, when you talked about me trying to broadcast my voice between levels of heaven, I immediately thought of that radically confrontational nude Michael coming down to blow my mind with quantum paradoxes and other things like that, which I don't know if I dare open my mouth, but in terms of what Desmond's talking about, I think it was what we were just talking about here in that there's that there's a moreness to things that we can't name, that they're never summed up in, you know, by the accumulation of parts up to them, but there's always this excess to them that's emergent. Or in object-oriented ontology, which I think is really getting at this, that it's taking the moreness of God and putting it in everything. Butter withdraws from our ontological access. You know, aardvarks, as John likes to throw in aardvarks in his conversation, aardvarks withdraw from us in terms of they have a mysterious ontological depth that can't be grasped through any form of knowing that, you know, that relates to identifiable parts or categorizes or anything like that, that there's always an excess.
I was just in Toronto with the Integral Leadership team working toward Emerge Toronto, and I I have this aardvark shirt that I made that has an obscure quote from a Matt Berry British TV show on it, but there was a lot of discussion last night about aardvarks. I think for me, it's in my own mind, it's important to keep in play the distinction between, I'll say again, the hyperphatic and the hypophatic here, right? That we have an ethical and practical necessity to hold open the space of the potential moreness of each and every other, including things. But it's also important to say, when is that potential actually instantiated in my experience? Right? When are beings more than just beings? When do we reach for a term like was really real, right? It didn't just exist as a fact of existing, it had that suchness. That suchness is it's a relative discernment. It's in excess of merely existing. It's existing lifted to some additional capacity where it strikes us as valid because it stands forth in its moreness, a moreness whose potential we have to hold open, but we don't get access to it merely because we're holding it open. We have to actually find those places and do the constructive work, even if that constructive work is in the instant of perceiving. There's an activity that goes on in order to bring the possibility of the moreness into the actuality of the moreness. And that our ability to do that is what enables us to live in the world as a spiritual participatory realm. And then conversely, the sabotaging of our ability to do that allows us to live in a world where false ontological excess is sold back to us, where you don't buy the McDonald's French fries, you buy the ethereal glow of the gold of the McDonald's French fries. Right? There's a sense in which we inhabit a system that wants us to buy pseudo ontological excess. And the way out of that system has got to involve us teaching each other to be better at the actual practice of turning potential excessive ontonormativity into actualized access to ontonormativity.
Yeah, this is right out of Schindler. This is like the promise of the good. So if you're in the cave and everything seems like golden French fries and everything is like a power game or whatever, and then you ascent towards the good. I mean, it's always like the irony, right? Is that, and they even Chris and John get into that, like the good reaches into you, right? Like you're surprised by Socrates. Who knows how Diotima got her power? She surprised Socrates, and then Socrates surprises Athens, and there's this constant, like the good is reaching from outside in. And then if you trust that and then follow it, it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy where then it becomes a moreness that then becomes a suchness with a moreness still in potentia for it. So yeah, I love what you were saying there, Layman. I hope it wasn't too obscured by the kind of Neoplatonic language of it all. But yeah, the idea that like, and it works in alchemy too. The idea that like if you're when your ego confronts yourself, there's a the ego needs to stay conscious and the self needs to stay present. So you really need both in the tension to have that move of the transcendent third from the encounter between the self and the ego. And that perpetual like the one becomes the two becomes the one again of alchemy. So I love that this kind of esoteric symbolic. Even John mentioned the symbolon. I don't know, do either of you read to take much credit or take much interest when he started to talk about symbolons and that kind of need for this sacred glue between these like encounters between things? Does that make sense? Maybe it doesn't.
Are you talking about when he was talking about like for instance, the role of the icon?
Right, right. Yeah, exactly. What he said, like Kierkegaard has to not only be ironic, but iconic in his presentation of things. And expression needs to be both. It reminded me a lot of like if you reify the absolute too much or the relative too much. He was trying to kind of preserve the integrity of both.
I mean, it's interesting. It's a classic spiritual strategy to try to locate the transcendental in the transparency of a particular finite thing that acquires unto itself so many meaningful reference that it exceeds its ability to hold those things. And so you can take it to people, and if they appreciate how many things, we were talking about this last time a little bit as well, you know, the way a symbol can point to a layer above itself. And part of the reason it can do that is it brings together so many things from the conventional level that it can't hold those things. And insofar as the perceiver, experiencer appreciates that excessive dimension, they're naturally pulled toward some other level, which is needed to describe what cannot be contained in this level. This level is perfectly adequate if everything is kept separate and not allowed to talk to each other. Right? Chris and John talked a little bit about compartmentalization and the way that you know, which has a legitimate functional role in a lot of our lives, but it inhibits the process of finding that through line. And that through line is needed in order to access a realm of patterning that exceeds the layer that you're currently playing at.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I love that, Layman. The reaching from the higher level into the lower level as part of like a really important aspect of these kind of symbols and how they're again like this, they're generating this movement towards moreness through the moreness of itself. Yeah, that's really cool.
There seems to be like an eruptive IRR, eruptive quality to it, and I think Kierkegaard gets at that too. That there is, you know, that the grace or authentic encounter is what you were getting at before about that the dimension of surprise, that it's something that erupts into presence. Whether, you know, I think there's a question whether, you know, I think it's legitimate to have, you know, objects and symbols serve those functions. And someone like, I think his name is Adam Miller with his book Speculative Grace. He's talking about the transcendence, the pulverization of transcendence, and the pulverization of grace and the pulverization of transcendence. But in a way, he seems to be getting at that there's actually a way of living and being in which that eruptive quality and that excess and that symbol function can manifest anywhere in the environment. It doesn't need to be pinned down necessarily in a ritual environment, but it could become a mode of encounter that is more broadly distributed in and through life.
One of the things that strikes me as interesting is the way that we seem to be able to sort of back our way into that dimension of things. And it's a big part of developmental theory communities, where sort of what's Keegan's phrase about how the subject of one stage becomes the object of the subject of the next stage. So one of the things, if you use that lens, one of the things Kierkegaard is doing is making an object, so to speak, of some part of himself, right? He's ironically turning aspects of himself and whole world spaces that he has access to into these icons. And in doing so, he backs up, he steps away from that. He's now imperfectly identified with it. He's moved backwards into a more meta space, a more eruptive space, something which, has a different impact when you're facing it in that religious mode. But you can also sort of creep back into it merely by focusing on the attempt to more precisely articulate the affectively inhabited version of some aspect of the self, which is also going to be some aspect of the selves of everyone else as well, right? When he discovers his aesthete or his ethicist, he's also discovering something that's true of many human beings, and he's creeping backwards into a space that has more liberty, more possibilities relative to that, merely by foregrounding the iconification of aspects of the self and the worlds that those aspects inhabit.
Yeah, that's a lot to think about. That was a pretty rich statement there, Layman. Yeah, it's he's so subtle, but like I love that we got into this kind of part of Kierkegaard that was is a little more subtle than some of his simple things. Yeah, the paradoxicality of it. It's like this. There's a logos moving through everything, but we're like a partial participant. We have like a partial perspective on this logos, and we're also generating logos within ourselves.
There's a thing here, like the notion of the absolute relation to the absolute that Chris brings up. It just leapt up in my mind just now because I realized I was describing like occluded finsting, right? There's the gesture you make towards something, but there's also the gesture that's implied without you really focusing on it. So there's this, you can make this shift from just being a developmentalist where you're becoming more and more complex. Your space is increasing in some sense that you're gesturing toward a thing you're not really focused on. It's just accumulating by virtue of the fact that you're taking this more engaged but more released stance relative to yourselves. So there's an occluded but implied finsting, but that's not the full relationship to that thing, right? You actually have to at some point become religious in the sense of turning around and beholding the finsting that's been previously implied. And is it just me, or does finsting sound like an obscene sexual act? Are there whole series of online finsting videos that I'm not aware of?
I can imagine in like the 80s, there's like a Blockbuster video, and you're in the sci-fi section, and you're like, oh, what is that Gansfeld finsting video down in the bottom row? And it looks like it's in some shadowy alley.
Hardcore abstraction.
Uh-huh.
That was basically the idea behind the meme I sent around this morning. And he did actually talk quite a lot in his discussion of finsting about stretching and interpenetration. So people could
Good, it's not just me.
The irony that like every cognitive scientist, except for like there are some exceptions, like overwhelmingly, if you were to have a category of cognitive scientists, they're the least likely to do real what the ironic referent of your finsting joke is. They're the most like straight and narrow, boring people. Even John describes himself as like a potted plant in conversation. So it takes that level of like sober boredom to analyze the finsting of the world. You can't be doing both at the same time, I don't think, Bruce. I mean, although I guess maybe that's where the metaxu is to be that kind of finster. You need to have this like almost Anaxagorean kind of prowess or skillfulness in your virtue.
Well, if cognitive science is true to its own principles, then it has to sway beyond the boundary of its affective predispositions in order to make sure it's not getting over optimized.
Yeah, they over optimize for plaid shirts and a lack of like BDSM or something like that in the cognitive science departments, I would say. But that's why the noise, right? You need to have a little bit of these dynamics talking to each other, because if you overfit Enlightenment ideals, you end up with like the world we're in. So perhaps some of this like Finsting noise is exactly what the algorithm needs.
Little
Definitely not a
Dionysian
flat
spirit.
ontology. Yeah. What was that, Bruce? Sorry.
Little Dionysian spirit.
That's right. We are super Apollonian. I would say the European philosophical spirit is too Apollonian and not Dionysian enough. Again, like Christ, who again, he's such a great Dionysian figure. Be like the lily in the field, don't go to work, steal a donkey. Like there's all of this in the New Testament, and it gets overlooked for the more kind of almost Zoroastrian, like black and white, good and evil battle for the soul that we get into here. Is there anything else from the episode that you two wanted to talk about? I mean, we could definitely wrap up a little early if everything on my notes got covered. I'm sure there's moreness to each and every entity in the world, but
I've touched a lot of my favorite things about Kierkegaard's, and I'd be quite happy to end on the note of Finsting.
we started with Black and White Elvis and ended with Finsting. I think that's exactly how every flight should go. Bruce, anything else that
This
you
is
were?
Kierkegaard's argument. It's got to be more particular and more absurd. Otherwise, it doesn't really fulfill the Hegelian dream.
We kind of went to the aesthetic of our joking and lost the ethical. So the imbalance has reasserted itself into the world. Bruce, anything else? I don't want to cut you off.
No, I enjoyed the conversation. I think, I don't know if my sharing about the I, thou, I, it, I actually landed anywhere, but for me, I was really feeling about what we were in that I relationship. I think we were talking about that movement of conformity, participatory knowing with the other that's beyond simply the acknowledgement of the otherness. And at the same time, it actually you need a proper detachment, an ironic detachment, in order to actually achieve that level of intimacy. In order to be able, because yeah, if you're entangled with your own desire and wants and needs and all of those kinds of things, so there's that simultaneously stepping back and merging into that, I think is really key in this whole movement.
Yeah, the the hyperphatic possibility where the not total merging with, but not too separated from the I of the other becomes available, right? Where the moreness is accessible. That in order to do that, you have to bring the I really close to the other I. And it doesn't seem like you can do that without previously having othered your I, right? Because then if the gap between the I and the other I is too extreme, but the gap between the othered I and the other I is just close enough to allow the instantiation of the hyperphatic, which makes something like irony necessary for love, which is, I think Kierkegaard is arguing.
Yeah, I love like the Socratic Tau erotica of Socrates is able to like participate in the nonsense of the people in the dialogues while maintaining his like self-possession of what virtue is or what the good is, or and again, like they keep coming back to Kyoto School, like they're so good at recognizing objects and subjects and transcendence and kind of holding the integrity of all three in their ironic way. So yeah, that's what else is there anything else, Bruce, on that line? Because we definitely could have gone down the I thou road more. I think the logos of all the low guy interpenetrating kind of gets at that, but didn't kind of land in that domain that you were talking about explicitly.
Yeah, no, I'm happy with how we circulated around all of that, and because of the other things I'm working on right now, my mind kept going to something like Gelassenheit and Anwesenheit in terms of the right posture that we have with things. Where for me, just recently exploring with students, the Gelassenheit was very, very similar to what Layman was talking about, is this stepping back behind ourselves in the allowing of the presencing of things, including the presencing of our own being, intertwined with everything else. So anyway, I'm happy with that. That was my own little private place I was going with that, but I think we covered a lot, and no reason to entangle Sloterdijk and Levin and Heidegger all up in the same big fencing puddle. It just doesn't seem right.
We fenced too much, and now there's a mess on everyone's hands. This is just almost unbearable. If there's time to take a shower, yeah, we should have just a Sloterdijk book club recording sometime. I've got a couple of his books downloaded and just haven't plowed through them. But I really appreciate that you keep bringing so many great thinkers outside of John's work that are adjacent or dug deeper into some of these places from a different lens. Layman, any final fencing thoughts or anything else that you want to, any good t-shirts that we should be making at this point?
I think there's a lot of possibilities around interpenetration, hardcore fencing, and maybe overfitting that could be on t-shirts. I'd like to, I think, just say to developmental theory communities and the communities that are adjacent to those models, that there's so much richness in Kierkegaard, where there's a tendency to favor someone like Hegel, these kind of Wilberian big picture model makers. But Kierkegaard has different lines of intelligence. Kierkegaard has stages on life's way. Kierkegaard has transcendental spirit. He's got a huge number of these components, but he brings this different sensibility to it. He really wants to foreground this intensity that you have to accept in order for any of this to be real in your life, which is my favorite thing about Kierkegaard. It's so much about your life in this matter and not someone's life.
Yeah, his immediacy is really unique in the canon of philosophical thinkers, and his capacity to kind of keep morality both abstract and concrete, and in kind of the mystery of what the potential things is good. Yeah, so I will resist every urge in my body to make any more puns or wordplay on cognitive science constructs. But it was a joy to see both of you, and yeah, I really, it's so cool to just look at John's work together with both of you, because I get so much out of your personalities and your interactions with John's work and your history with each other. Yeah, it's just such a joy to do this. So I'm looking forward to next time, which will only be one episode. How will we ramble and meander with only one thing to talk about? It's going to be quite a fun time. Cool. Well, great to see you both.
Yeah, but
okay,
just to return back beyond the logistics, I also appreciated this exchange a lot. So thank you for hosting.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to do these with you, Robert.
Well, yeah, I really enjoy this as well. I'll see you guys next week then at some point.
All right.
Cheers.
All right.
Take
Don't
care.
fence too much. Bye, Bruce.